let's talk about our next great philosopher, Immanuel Kant, who was born in 1704, so after the death of Thomas Hobbes. He inherits, of course, the accomplishment of Thomas Hobbes, but also that of other major philosophers, and maybe we should mention John Locke, who never produces an actual ethics. He attempted to produce an ethics, a natural law based, he would have argued, on scripture. He was attempting to develop a kind of rationalized Christian moral doctrine. He didn't succeed at that. David Hume is worth mentioning. He had an ethics based upon natural sympathy. And then there were a number of other Scottish thinkers. Hutcheson perhaps should be mentioned amongst them. It's Hutcheson, Francis Hutcheson. Okay. Kant enters as the next great major theorist. Hume counts certainly. Hume is H-U-M-E, David Hume. I can't fit everybody into the course, so I'm not teaching him. I'll probably try to squeeze him in at some point in the future. It's bad enough I left out the Epicureans, right? One has to make certain choices. And Kant is recognized as offering one of the great ethical systems and systems of moral philosophy that is mentioned in the same breath with Aristotle, particularly. Now, when you like if you were to study business ethics or bioethics, typically, they don't mention Stoicism. Okay, they definitely mention Thomist natural law. That's another big player. Of course, they mention Aristotelianism. So, an Aristotelian virtue ethics, a Thomist natural law theory, Hobbes' ethical egoism. Okay. In a course like that, Hume tends not to get play. And Kantian, what we call deontology, gets mentioned, and then later we'll turn to Mill's utilitarianism. And those tend to be what one talks about as far as ethical theories that one uses in specific areas of ethical inquiry, like bioethics, that's medical ethics effectively. A little bit broader than that, biomedical research and things of that sort. Even biological research in a way, and business ethics and things of that sort. And we'll study, as a matter of fact, Hegel for a good deal of our semester because he sheds light on everything. And then Nietzsche, who introduces a kind of ethic of self-overcoming, which we'll examine towards the end. Self-overcoming and also a critique of the history of ethics. Based on his genealogical method. All right, so now let's talk about Immanuel Kant. Now, up to this point, we have looked at the background metaphysics for each of these ethical positions and found that that really plays a very large role in how a philosopher goes on to specify his ethical or moral doctrine. And we have seen Plato's doctrine of atheistic supernaturalism, right? That there's an idea of the good emanating goodness, and it becomes the job of the philosopher, as it were, to enact that goodness within the realm of sense to the best of his ability. It's the only rational thing to do from the standpoint of the Platonic philosopher, right? So it's not, well, I'll leave it at that. It's not a strict ethical altruism, right? It's definitely not a theism. It's based in a concept of goodness, which then produces altruistic outcomes. But it's not altruism at its base. It's a kind of almost a quasi-religious position. Only you're not worshiping a god. This is goodness. Then we have theistic supernaturalism, and theistic supernaturalism is characteristic of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim thought. We examined for 2 periods the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas, his natural law theory, and we saw he has a theory of the virtues. It's basically Aristotle's theory, only brought to a higher level of refinement and exactitude. He also provides us with a very thorough doctrine of the human emotions, the only thorough treatment of the emotions up to that point in the history of philosophy. We got another one later with Rene Descartes. We have seen theistic naturalism in the case of the Stoics. And we saw that the Stoics have two principal distinctions, that between what you can control and that which is outside of your control. Concern yourself with the former and dismiss the latter. But then they have a second distinction, and that is that which concerns the self and that which is ordered by God. And when you look at things outside of yourself as ordered by God, you're looking at them from a new point of view, which sort of rehabilitates them in a way. And now, even though they're outside of your control, right, you now affirm them as good and desire them to be exactly as they are, and that will make you happy. That's really the complete fruition of Stoicism. Okay. Now, moving on to, well, as far as atheistic naturalism, okay, I argue that Hobbes is an atheistic naturalist. He does say that God exists, but he says that God is needed to explain the beginning of motion in the universe. He also said that God is a body, so he's not a Christian. For Christianity, God is a spirit. Second person of the Holy Trinity became incarnate, but in and of himself, as Holy Trinity, he's spirit. So Hobbes is not a Christian. And if he believes in a God at all, it's a God of philosophers, and you can't worship him. And he's probably completely impersonal. So, and he's also a body inside of the universe. So it's not an object of worship. It seems to be an original, as it were, power or release of a kind of impulse transmitted or communicated to bodies, so that the entire chain and sequence of causes and effects and the complex interaction of bodies in the universe can have a beginning. So that's not really a belief in God. So that's why I call him an atheistic naturalist, and unsurprisingly, he's an egoist. So now we get to Kant. Here's the thing. Kant is not, strictly speaking, a theistic supernaturalist, nor an atheistic supernaturalist, nor a theistic naturalist, nor an atheistic naturalist. You say, well, how can he not be any of those things? Because those are the logical alternatives. And it's because he has developed a new form of skepticism. Okay. Now, he wouldn't call himself a skeptic, by the way, but for our purposes, we're going to call him a skeptic, just so I can make this intelligible to you. This is an introductory course. You're probably never taking another philosophy course ever again. I have to do something to make this accessible to you. Okay, so there are three classes of skepticism that we can concern ourselves with here. Ancient skepticism, Pyrrhonic skepticism, okay, of the ancient period. Okay, that's marked by the basic assumption that one can find considerations on either side of a question. For example, God exists or he doesn't exist, or human beings are free or they're not free. The ancient skeptics say you can find considerations on either side of a question of equal weight, so that rationally one ought not to decide for either answer to any of the fundamental philosophical questions, right? So that form of skepticism depends upon a prior rule. Prior rule is that for any philosophical question one can bring forward, it will always be the case that one can find equally balanced considerations on either side of it. The difficulty with that position is that that's an arbitrary assumption that could only be made out by actually examining all of the arguments on either side of a question. And if you do that, you may end up deciding that one or other side actually has the preponderance or the weight of reasons weighing in its favor, right? So their form of skepticism appears to be somewhat artificial. So we'll put that to one side. And then we arrive at David Hume. David Hume has a skepticism based in a doctrine of impressions, namely that the only things we can really genuinely be certain of are our immediate impressions, or sense data, your immediate experience of red and blue and of shapes and things of that sort, and the shape red thing. And secondly, certain relations of ideas, like 2 + 2 = 4. Like you don't have to actually see two apples and see another two apples, put them together in order to figure out that they make 4. You just think about it and see that 2 + 2 = 4. And those are your two sources of knowledge for Hume. Why is he a skeptic? Because he maintains that if you really think this through, you end up destroying the entire vocabulary of metaphysics. Okay? Particularly, famously, the concept of cause and effect. He maintains that, the idea of one billiard ball in motion causing a second billiard ball to move with a certain angular momentum is not based on any perception of the causal power of the first billiard ball to move the second, but merely on our repeated experience of the first moving in a certain way, coming into contact with the second, producing a cracking sound, usually if we're not deaf, and then watching the second ball move with a certain angular momentum. And on the basis of habit and custom, we then arrive at the concept of causation. Okay, so the difficulty with Hume's theory is that he can't account for, actually makes it impossible to account for any kind of consistent order in the universe, because his critique, in effect, if thought all the way through, implies that actually we're not justified in describing any causal connections between anything in the world, so that the fact that day follows night and night follows day, that two giraffes, male and female, produce another giraffe, not an octopus, not a stone or anything of that sort, that the seasons move in regular cycles, so on and so forth, and that if you apply yourself to working wood in a certain way, you can build a desk, right? And if you work at it in a different way, you can build a chair, right? He can't account for any of that. And so that more or less functions as a kind of reductio ad absurdum of his entire philosophy. He reduces the entire order of the cosmos and of the human segment of the cosmos to arbitrariness and sheer chance. But nothing with that degree of order can arrive from sheer chance. There have to be laws involved, and possibly even intelligence. So we put him to one side. Now we get to Immanuel Kant, and Kant is also skeptical concerning metaphysics like Hume was. Okay, so he dismisses all four metaphysical possibilities, but on that basis, he's going to then construct a new sort of moral theory. Okay, so let's just back up for a second. Why does he dismiss those prior theories? Well, Aquinas says that the ends of human existence, he reduces them to two, is being perfectly wise, or if you like to speak in a more colloquial idiom, being perfectly reasonable, and then being morally perfect, or being perfectly sociable. So for Aquinas, we're to be perfectly wise in the area of theory, like knowing all the sciences, and we are to be morally perfect. And for him, that takes the form of perfect virtue, and indeed a supernatural virtue, the supernatural virtue of love, holy charity. But Thomas Hobbes, he disagrees. Thomas Hobbes says, no, the end and aim of human existence is comfortable self-preservation. And that's not a matter of achieving a degree of perfection. That's just a matter of impulse and what we pursue, whether we will or no. It's just built into our nature. That's what we do. And after a lifetime, well, until the age of 40 or so, Kant tried to settle these sorts of disputes. He actually followed a fellow named Leibniz, and Leibniz's disciple Wolff, Christian Wolff. But eventually, Kant thought he discovered decisive reasons to reject the very possibility of answering those sorts of metaphysical questions and solving the dispute between someone like Aquinas or Hobbes. He never read Aquinas, but no matter. In principle, he would say that you couldn't settle that dispute. And so he actually publishes an 800-page book called The Critique of Pure Reason, in which he tries to show systematically on the basis of rigorous argumentation that metaphysics is not possible as a science, okay? That is, as a body of exact knowledge. All right. However, if you grant that, you still have the consciousness of your duty, D-U-T-Y, your moral obligations. You know what you're supposed to do. You know you're not supposed to lie to your mother. You know you're not supposed to steal from a friend. In fact, you know you're not supposed to lie to anybody. And you're not supposed to steal, period. Okay? You know it. I know it. Everyone knows it except psychopaths. And they're broken people, right? So psychopaths, you put them to one side because they belong to a chapter of abnormal psychology. I have nothing against them. Right? Incidentally, it appears that psychopaths are either born that way or traumatic experiences in childhood produce psychopathy. So it seems to be an involuntary condition, right? So I can accuse somebody for having an involuntary attribute. What happens is that the persons are responsible for how they conduct themselves, right? Once they find themselves the way that they are. The difficulty with psychopathy is that they don't have any conscience, right? So they're not going to be motivated by what I just said. All right, so that's just an aside. Morality. Your idea of moral obligation, of moral duty. Here's the key here. It includes the idea of necessity, okay? And the idea of necessity is incompatible with there being some kind of contingent choice, right? Back up for a second. Your idea of necessity is incompatible with there being a choice that's contingent on the choice of one's end, right? You're going to follow Aquinas or Hobbes. Well, then your system is going to look somewhat different. In Aquinas, we get the natural law, but we also get an exhortation to cultivate the virtues. In Hobbes, you get a version of the natural law too, but there is no virtue in Hobbes, right? So you get two different moral systems. All right. But morality includes rules which are necessary and binding on one with a certain necessity. Another one of those issues in moral theory, the bindingness of the moral theory. Well, the bindingness of the moral rules, right? The moral theory exists significantly to explain the bindingness of moral rules we all recognize. In the case of Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas, the bindingness is traced back to wisdom. For Aristotle, the wisdom of the wise man. For Aquinas, God's wisdom, infinite wisdom, right? The bindingness for Hobbes was a bit more complicated. It's traced back to a promise on the condition that that promise, the mutual promising, is backed by the force of the sovereign, right? Okay, let's look at a couple of arguments that are Kantian in spirit here, okay? Premise number one, all moral laws are intrinsically necessitating. That means there's a prohibition against murder, and that's that. And you don't have any choice. It's necessitating on your will. You can't make an exception to it. That's what that means. So likewise with theft and perjuring and slandering people and so on and so forth. Premise number two, no rules insofar as they are merely justified by natural law theory, from Kant's way of looking at things, are intrinsically necessitating. Not intrinsically necessitating, they're only necessary on the condition, right, that human nature has a certain end. You get that? And that's true. We saw in Aristotle and Aquinas that there are intrinsically evil actions like murder and rape and adultery, okay? But murder and rape and adultery are, Kant would say, these are prohibited in natural law theory because they are counter-instrumental, right? They are counter to the end you're seeking, and that is perfect virtue. The real end being virtue. Kant says, no, we can't make virtue the end. The end is simply, there's an end at all, and there is one. The end is simply to act in accordance with one's consciousness of duty, because it's one's duty, period. Okay, it's a different way of thinking about ethics, but we're familiar with it. You do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, whatever the consequences, right? Particularly for oneself. The conclusion is no rules insofar as they are justified merely by natural law are moral rules. So that's how he thinks about it, okay? So this is Kant's day in the sun, so just kind of go with it and think about it. Second argument, pretty close to the first. The rules of natural law can, in principle, vary with the varying conception of man's end. Now, perhaps St. Thomas Aquinas and Hobbes agree on the Ten Commandments, right? But then if you look more closely, you might say, well, maybe actually they don't, because for Aquinas, he thinks he can demonstrate rationally from first premises, without appealing to faith or revelation, that each person does owe it to God to worship him, and that one should never take his name in vain, and that one should set aside one day at least, particularly to honor him. So you should worship him throughout the week and set one side a day that's just his, right? Aquinas thinks you can demonstrate that on the basis of premises accessible to all human beings. Doesn't matter if they're Christian or not, or Jewish or not, or Muslim or not, or Hindu or not, it doesn't make any difference. So Hobbes would disagree with that. Hobbes would disagree with that. So look at that, that gives a little bit more meat, or like some mojo to this premise here. The rules of natural law can in principle vary with the varying conceptions of man's end. Well, turns out that's true. Okay. Premise number 4, no moral laws can vary. That's what Kant would say. All right. So notice what Kant's doing. He's saying moral laws don't turn on your conception of your natural end. You're conscious of their necessity and of their being invariant, and that's enough. Somehow, your immediate consciousness of the bindingness of moral laws, okay, is incorrigible. It can't be corrected because it's right. And it can't not be right because it's comparable to your immediate consciousness of the color red. If red is appearing to you, then red is appearing to you. You follow me? Maybe you're asleep and dreaming about it, but if you can dream a color, my friends, and red is appearing to you in your dream, red is appearing to you in your dream, but it is appearing to you, okay? And if you have a consciousness of your duty, from Kant's point of view, that is your duty. You get it? Now, he will then go on and try to give us a rational demonstration that certain moral precepts are duties, okay? So, and that's going to be important, because if his whole argument came down to saying that your consciousness of something being necessary makes it necessary, then one could make an objection to his theory by appeal to schizophrenics who hear voices who tell them to do terrible things and who claim that they had to do them because the voice in their head told them to do it, right? And they even seem to have a kind of schizophrenic conscience, according to which doing some horrible thing is actually morally necessary. So it's a peculiar feature of Kantianism. He does, in fact, place singular stress on your consciousness of duty and doing your duty for duty's sake. The danger of that is that he's going to make morality, it'll be even worse than natural law theory, right? He'll make morality totally contingent and subjective. That makes it very dangerous, right? But then, in the second step, he tries to give us a rational method for identifying what our duties actually are and what things cannot possibly be duties. And in a third step, he wants to link his method for I'll show you how he does it later. He wants to link his method for identifying moral duties with your conscience. And your conscience is your consciousness of, right, your duties, right? Conscience and consciousness are obviously related terms, but they're different. So it may be that somebody out there, and it has been the case that somebody has a conscience that tells them to commit some horrible act. But when you examine the rule upon which they're acting, you will see that the rule is incoherent. And if it's incoherent, you ought not to act on it. Okay? So those would be particular cases of really insanity. Kant would probably want to argue that you can't take a case of insanity as adjudicating my theory, Kant's theory, right? That's the case of a broken person. You have to understand the functioning of conscience and the consciousness of your duty as tied tightly to your ability to reason. Everyone has the ability to reason things out morally, and I know with certainty, as certain as you know that 2 + 2 = 4, that murder is prohibited, theft is prohibited, perjuring your neighbor is prohibited. And he would add, adultery is prohibited, and so on. Okay? All right. He would even add suicide is prohibited. Okay. So then what about virtue? The excellence of character which makes you perform your actions at a higher level. Well, he says, look at courage. Courage, a kind of steely ability, right, to face danger, confront danger, and to move forward towards whatever you're trying to accomplish. He says courage can be used for an evil end, right? How many movies do we have that present some kind of villain who nonetheless possesses a certain kind of fortitude and grit? Okay. Temperance, likewise, which is the perfection of self-control. Self-control, they get so good, it becomes natural to you, as natural as leaves springing from the branch of a tree. Okay. Now, no, Aristotle and Aquinas deny that either of these things here, right, are genuinely courage or temperance if we're using them for evil ends. And that explaining why they would say that might take us a bit afield. So we'll just note that they would deny it, that they can be used for evil ends, and move on. Now, even a certain wisdom may be used for evil. Okay. Like practical wisdom. Now, Aristotle would say that would degenerate into cleverness. And, I think this we can explain. Aristotle has pretty good reasons for distinguishing cleverness from practical reason. Because the way that the merely clever man reasons has some overlap with the person of practical reason, but it differs almost globally. When you think about, a business leader who is genuinely practically wise because he's a good person, he's thinking about ways of helping his workers develop, of encouraging them, of teaming them up in ways that'll be more productive for the company, that'll help each person grow and increase your revenue and profit while serving the common good. Okay? The wicked man is thinking about, how to keep persons under his authority more or less uncertain and intimidated, because he thinks that's how you get people to work, keeping them under your thumb and they're knowing their place, being afraid of being fired. And he's thinking about, if he's a really bad man, how to more or less tell some of the women what they have to do in order to rise in the organization. You see what I'm saying? I mean, these are two different moral universes entirely. So cleverness and practical wisdom are opposed to one another. Okay? All right. So let's see here. Recall, let's continue the reasoning here. Recall that if one possesses knowledge of how to achieve an end, one possesses knowledge of how to achieve its opposite. Hence, a medical doctor is, as a matter of fact, an expert killer. I saw a couple of documentaries which depicted a very, very harrowing story of some persons going to a hospital, and they had like a condition, one person with Down syndrome. And all the evidence is that they euthanized this person. Okay, I'm sorry to say that. I can send you the documentary if you like. But a doctor, they know how to kill you if they want you dead. All right. This seems to happen a few times, by the way. This is illustrated in the instance of, well, abortionists. There we go. In our country alone, I think there have been 50 million to 60 million abortions since 1973. And in Canada, they administer euthanasia in not in Denmark, maybe in Denmark, but in Holland. And I think they're doing it in Washington State, right? So Socrates' ruler knows how to perfect his subjects. If you remember from the beginning of the course, he also knows how to corrupt them. So the craftsmen of consumerist propaganda, that is our marketers and advertisers, propaganda fostering materialist egoism, constant eroticization, and a blind will to work long hours for one's paymasters without asking questions exemplify this sort of negative knowledge, right? Okay. Knowledge that can be turned to good, but also to evil. So looked at the other way round, Thrasymachus, as tyrant, knows how to exploit his subjects, but he also knows how to benefit them, right? After all, I mean, even a sheepherd or a rancher knows how to benefit the animals he is cultivating, and then he slaughters them later and sells them on the market. So from Kant's point of view, wisdom may serve good or evil. I've argued against that, right? But this is, we're trying to understand him. Wisdom may serve good or evil, so being wise is not enough for being good. Okay. Incidentally, he didn't tackle the religious concept of holiness. That cannot serve evil by definition. Right? There's no such thing as being holy and serving evil, because holiness includes purity and holy charity, right? So that's impossible. So number two, the first positive step Kant takes is to clarify the idea of a proper motivation. You want to be motivated in the right way when you're conducting yourself. And here's what a proper motivation is. Acting from duty, that means your consciousness of duty, for duty's sake. You follow? He means that a moral action is one in which an individual knows what his moral duty, his obligation is, and does what this knowledge requires for the sake of the duty that he knows binds him. That's Kantianism right there. If you just understand these three lines right here, even if you forget everything else I said, okay? If you understand these three lines, point number two, then you now understand Kantianism, okay? All right, but nonetheless, obviously he goes on and flushes this out. So here are some parallel formulations he introduces that you ought to know. One ought to act out of respect for the law. So acting from duty for duty's sake involves acting out of respect for the law. Okay? Now, that might be an implicit respect for the law. As you're conscious of your duty not to steal from your employer, you're not necessarily formulating the idea of the moral law as you're acting from your duty, but it's built into the experience that you can formulate the idea of the general moral law relative to or related necessarily to your specific duty. You get that? And if you were to formulate that concept and you are genuinely motivated to do your duty from, or pardon me, do your duty for duty's sake, then you would only regard that general moral law with respect. Make any sense? All right, there's another formulation he introduces, that is acting out of respect for the humanity in oneself and another, right? So to act from duty is to act, well, to act from duty for the sake of duty is to act in a way connected to your consciousness of the dignity of persons, okay? And sometimes he just says the humanity. Your humanity is the seat of your dignity, right? You possess dignity in virtue of your humanity, and so on. Okay. Then I reintroduce this formulation, acting out of respect for the dignity of persons. So we see how these things relate now, okay? Let's see here. Maybe I already explained some of this. Yeah, I explained this. Let's just move on here. So Kant analyzes the concept of acting from duty for duty's sake in accordance with the idea, here's a new idea for you, of universalizability, okay? It is useful to connect this from the get-go with the idea of legislation. So to legislate is to pass a law. So we're talking about moral laws now, right? And we're connecting your consciousness of your duty. You're being motivated to do your duty for the sake of duty. Okay? Your consciousness of the humanity of others as the seat of their dignity. You guys following along? Okay? And your ability to formulate moral rules which you can legislate for yourself and others, because a legislator is legislating for himself and others as a matter of course, right? In a manner that is universalizable. That means you can formulate moral, I'll explain how this works in a moment. You can formulate moral rules which are universalizable, right? And thus pass rational muster. Okay, this will get rather technical in a moment, so I have to just kind of move into it. So the core idea, not fully manifest until we get to the third formula, the categorical imperative, is that each of us is fully capable of authoring a complete moral code for all rational beings. And here's the sort of assertive humanistic element of Kant, including angels and God himself. Okay, so for Kant, we don't actually need God to legislate to us. We can legislate for all of humanity. And by the way, if you're doing this correctly, you're coming up with the exact same table of moral rules as any other rational agent can come up with. Kant does not say you get to make your own morality. He does not say that. He says that you can, as it were, discover within yourself through the use of reason the true morality. That's a completely different position. He's not a relativist. Okay? He believes in objective morality, but he turns his back on God and asserts that one can suffice on one's own as a moral legislator. Whereas for Aquinas, even though you discover the natural law on your own, or at least in principle you can, the being who legislates that natural law is God. Okay? All right. So it is our duty to act in ways that are motivated by a conception of universal rule or law or conduct. It's when you're conscious of the exceptionless character of the moral rule that you can't make an exception for yourself. That's the key idea there. Your consciousness of your duty in a way that is equivalent to, right? You're being conscious of your not being permitted, but being impermissible, that you make an exception for yourself and step outside of the moral community and act as a tyrant. Okay? That's what the evil man does. That's what a demon does, right? In a way, that's what the psychopath does, but a psychopath is not even aware of social distinctions, moral distinctions. Okay. All right. Okay, I think that's good enough. So here's how Kant analyzes the reasoning that accompanies correct moral motivation. So we'll do this, then we'll pause and come back next time. He presupposes that we act on maxims. So a maxim is a rule of action. Now we've been seeing this the entire semester. A rule that relates an end to a means, or in Kant's language, an aim to an action. So the aim would be what you're trying to attain. The action would be the means for attaining it. Okay? So the maxim might take this form. In order to gain money, that's your end, tell a lie. You say, loan me 20 bucks and I'll pay you back. You can lie while you're saying that. You pocket the $20 and skip town. In order to lose weight, eat 500 less calories a day. By the way, I think that's not how you lose weight, incidentally, but whatever. You got to eat whole foods. You know what causes people to apparently put on weight? They're not eating healthy food, and then their intestines get inflamed, right? And causes problems. So it's a bit more complicated, but if you look up, what's the name of the guy who explained this? I can't remember. He had a book on the microbiome and explained the whole thing. So in order to get a good grade, study this Kant sheet carefully 3 times. All right. So as rational beings, we routinely act on maxims. We're always pursuing goals and finding a path to the goal. We're always setting ends and finding a means to the end, right? That's what it is to be a rational agent. That's what it is. That's what you do. Okay. So most of what we do is guided by a maxim, which is a conception formulated as a statement relating what we are doing, the action, what we aim to accomplish through it. All right, very good. So we need 2 things: to be able to rule out immoral maxims, right? and second, to generate general moral rules. So we need some kind of rational procedure for ruling out what's immoral and for identifying what is moral and understanding it as moral precisely on account of its being an exceptionless rule, right? Okay. Now, we need to rule out the immoral maxims before we even identify the moral rules. It sounds peculiar, but that is how he proceeds. That is, we can rule out certain actions without having yet formulated specific rules of morality. Maybe I shouldn't say that as a theoretical necessity that we do that, but the way that Kant reasons is such that we can rule out immoral maxims first, and it's precisely in virtue of ruling out the immoral maxim that we're able then to arrive at the moral rule, okay? Because we arrive at it by negation. I'll show you. Okay. Now, nonetheless, we have to begin with a universal moral rule called the categorical imperative. So I recommend you memorize categorical imperative. It's getting kind of cold in here. I think somebody's left the door open in my building. All right. So please memorize this technical term in Kant, categorical imperative, right? So we can do both 1 and 2 through one process of reasoning. This process of reasoning explains what Kant calls the first formulation of the categorical imperative. And here it is. You have to know this formulation. Act only on that maxim which you can at the same time will as a universal law of nature. He adds of nature a little bit later, okay? All right, so here are the steps. Take this maxim as an example. In order to gain money, tell someone a lying promise. For example, loan me $20 and I promise to pay you back next week. Okay, now note the following. To act on a maxim, call it X, is to take acting on X in some situation to be reasonable, so that you would hold that anyone acting in a sufficiently similar situation, right, ought to act in the same way, ought to act on the same maxim, right? So to take acting on X in that situation to be reasonable is to commit oneself to holding that others ought to take acting that way in that situation to be reasonable. I call that A. A is acting that way in that situation, acting on that maxim in that situation. Okay. So therefore, to act on X is to commit oneself to holding that others ought to take A to be reasonable. But now look at this. To hold that others ought to take A to be reasonable is to commit oneself to believing that in a perfectly rational world, right? To commit yourself, slow down, commit yourself to believing that in a perfectly rational world, everyone would act on that maxim in that situation. Because everyone would be motivated by the thought of what is rational or reasonable. That's what it means to have a perfectly rational world. People would always do what's rational or reasonable rather than simply act from their passions, okay? To believe that everyone would conform to that pattern of acting on that maxim in that situation type, in that type of situation, in a perfectly rational world is to be committed to the belief that acting on that maxim in that type of situation would be a law of nature in that perfectly rational world. Why would it be a law of nature? It would be a law of human nature. If every member of a species acts on a certain maxim in a certain situation, then acting on that maxim in that situation is a law for that species. Make any sense? Okay. Now notice that the structure of a maxim differs from the structure of a law. A maxim takes the general form: in order to X, do Y. If any students of logic in the class here, you could translate that as if X, do Y. If the in order to clause has the same logical force as if. If you haven't studied logic yet, don't worry about what I just said. Okay, so a maxim takes the general form of if in order to X, do Y. That's a prescription telling you what to do, but a practical law takes the structure of if agent A aims at X, then agent A will do Y or does Y. That's a description, right? Not a prescription, description, description. F, to act on X and Y, to act on that maxim in that situation is to commit oneself to the belief that A should be a law in R, okay? Should be a law in that perfectly rational world. That is how we get from the idea of a maxim of action to that of a law of nature, that is the law of a rational world, which world does it be conceived as a possible system of nature. So you can imagine different types of nature. In contemporary physics, they have an idea of the multiverse. The multiverse contains multiple universes, and these different universes have different laws, right? So each one is a possible world, and each possible world is defined by its possession of different laws. Okay, so now the reasoning continues. To act on X in Y, to act on that maxim in that situation type, is in part to constitute, this is a very important step here, it's in part to constitute the world in which acting on the maxim has become a universal law of nature. Now let's just pause there for a second, because when you act a certain way, you're making the world a certain way, right? Necessarily, because you're introducing an action into the world. And so you're building, right? Constituting in part a world in which people act on that particular kind of maxim. Okay. That's also in part to assert that others ought to act on this maxim, right? And that they are bound in virtue of their rationality to act on this very rule of action that I have adopted on the authority of my own rationality. That's to legislate for them, by the way, okay? This assumes the background rule that one always ought to choose the most reasonable or rational among a set of alternative maxims. That one's easy to grant. Number 3, in a word, to act on a maxim is to assert, even if indirectly, through one's very action. You can make indirect assertions by making certain choices, right? If someone walks into a store and steals a muffin, then he's indirectly indicating that one has a right to steal a muffin, at least under certain circumstances, right? So in a word, to act on a maxim is to assert that acting on the maxim is rational, and that all rational beings ought to do so. Now the reasoning reaches its crux. Here we go. The purpose of telling a lying promise is to gain money. That's the whole point of doing it, right? Obviously. But acting on a maxim is simultaneously to will the existence of the world, or a world, in which the maxim has become a universal law of nature. Now, what would happen if everybody acted on the maxim that whenever you want some money, tell a lie? Everyone did that. And someone asked you for some money. What would you do? Would you loan them the money, given that everybody who tries to borrow money from someone is, well, given that frequently, too frequently, when people say that they're going to pay you back, they just don't, because it's just a way to make money, a legitimate way to make money? No, you wouldn't. You would not. Because no one would believe a lying promise. In that world, right, that you're willing into existence and partially bringing into existence, you would not gain money, okay? Now, notice this, pay special attention to this. Not gaining money is a consequence, but the consequence by itself does not make the maxim immoral. Kant insists that the consequences have nothing to do with morality, okay? We're referring to a consequence, but that's not that on which the morality or immorality of the action turns. Explain this to you. So the relation between this consequence and the original purpose of the maxim is contradictory. That is that on which the morality or immorality of the maxim turns. So if you have a maxim, right, you're trying to achieve a certain end, but acting on the maxim is to, in part, bring into existence a world and to will the existence of a world in which you would not achieve that end. Now you're engaged in a contradiction, okay? So J here, by acting on a maxim in a certain situation, one wills to gain money and one wills not to gain money. To gain and not to gain, those two things don't fit together because they're mutually exclusive. And to will things that are mutually exclusive is to have an incoherence built into one's very will. Okay? So, telling lying promises is impermissible. The reason can be stated more simply. If you cannot tell someone your maxim of action, like you couldn't say it out loud to somebody, I'm only doing this because I'm trying to rip you off, right? Thus, making it known in a manner identical to how it would be known if your maxim were converted to a universal law of nature. If you cannot tell someone your maxim of action without failing in that purpose, that action is immoral. That formulation is a very easy one, and maybe it's really helpful to you. Now, this is very strict. It might scuttle some part of child rearing. You can't always tell your kids what you're up to, right? Much of the art of business negotiation, there definitely you're keeping things very close to the chest. A lot of the relationship between practitioner and client, right? So your psychiatrist is not, maybe therapist is not saying everything, right? And much of the governance of a country, the leaders aren't saying everything, are they? They're hardly saying anything at all that we would otherwise like to know, and frequently they lie. So similar arguments can be constructed ruling out assault, murder, rape, torture. We can rule out lying and all these other things too. But now we have to not merely rule out what is immoral. Now we have to go to the second step I identified earlier. We have to generate a moral rule. Here's how you do it. If acting on a maxim is contradictory, then isolate the action of the maxim, tell a lying promise, and negate it. Do not tell lying promises. And now you have a universal moral law. Do not tell lying promises, and that's that. Okay? So the result is now a specific categorical imperative. The general categorical imperative was act only on that law, which you can at the same time will as a universal law of nature. Okay? But now we have a specific categorical imperative. Do not tell lying promises. Maybe I should explain. They're imperatives because they give orders, and they're categorical because they do not have any conditions. Unconditionally, and in all circumstances, do not tell lying promises. Unconditionally, in all circumstances, do not murder. Now, if you think back to Republic Book 1 of Plato, we're supposed to pay our debts and tell the truth. But Socrates says that's conditional on the circumstances, provided we're dealing with sane people. Okay, so if an insane person comes to you and says, please give me the axe that I deposited at your house a couple of weeks ago, you say, oh, I'm sorry, I broke that axe, so I gave it away. Right? You follow? They're acting justly as conditional. Well, let me back up for a second. They're giving a person his due is conditional. And for Plato in that circumstance, it is just to withhold the axe. That is justice, because justice involves benefiting and not harming, right? Okay. Sorry for that brief slip there. Okay, so that is that. That's what you need to know. So we're going to pause there, and I will give you another lecture on Kant next week. All right. Hope that was clear enough. Be well.